My father, Abram Leland Stanley Nash, was born on a farm in South Cayuga on July the 6th, 1894. He was the youngest of 4 sons and 2 daughters, born to Annie Wismer and Daniel Nash. In 1904, the family moved to Dunnville and lived on Alder Street until 1936. Stan Nash worked for several merchants in town, and after attending and graduating from Dunnville High School, he began the Ontario Land Surveyors program, while at the same time apprenticing to surveyors in Haldimand and Brantford. By 1915, at age 21, he and others in Brantford enlisted to join the 40th Battery of the Royal Canadian Horse Artillery, after which he spent the next 4 years as a signaller in the Canadian Army, as part of the Imperial Army in Europe. During those years, he wrote almost every week, usually on a Sunday, if the action was not too intense, to all the members of his family, and also to a young woman in Brantford, who 6 years after the war ended, became his wife. After the war, he wrote a book, a rather dry account of the actual movements of his unit, the 40th Battery, as it moved back and forth in that narrow strip of land in northern France and Belgium. Comparison of the 2 versions, the book and his letters, are like night and day, an effort no doubt on his part to keep the family from worrying too much. Instead of describing the gruesome facts of life and death in the war zone, in the letters, he described the amusing details of eating food and smacking rats in the dugouts, and commenting on life as the folks back home in Dunnville reported. Training in Canada took place in Hamilton, in Toronto at the CE grounds, and in Kingston in 1915, where they learned how to ride horses, make gun fuses, and signals, among other things. In the book that he wrote, page 1, naturally it took some time for independent civilians, however intelligent, to absorb the military atmosphere. Everyone who was there had joined because it was his conviction that the country needed him to win the war. But it was difficult to see how turning out the guard, saluting officers, or peeling potatoes was contributing to that end. After arriving in England before the royal inspection in front of the king, a very big affair from their point of view, a week of polishing occupied every man, but in spite of our vaunted democracy, we were rather exalted and inspired at the thought of having been looked upon by royalty. But the training was intensive, and he wrote to Cousin Winnie, "Last night a Zepp, or some other infernal German contrivance, bombed the Rye Barracks a few miles from here, so our mail didn't come through." You cannot know how your letters cheer up this lonesome fellow, for even in so pretty a place as England is now, it is easy to get the grouchies. The most necessary thing to send to us is cheer. You will be doing your part in this way and this war every bit as much as Kitchener of Khartoum. And more to Winnie. "By the way, we saw the royal jewels at the Tower of London, and they are perhaps about as fine a collection of wealth as I have ever seen. All their splendor doesn't make them any happier. And if I were permitted just an odd hour in Dunnville again, I think I would be happier than any king." Continuing to Winnie, by July 15th, 1916, the group was off to France, or rather Belgium, near Ypres, where there had been so much fighting up to that point by the British that the city was in complete ruins. The Canadian force did not meet heavy fighting, but was given the chance to learn the ropes. John McCrae had written his poem In Flanders Fields earlier here in 1915. And he writes to Winnie, "Here we are, some hundreds of yards from the Hun defenses. I'm sorry to say we've had 2 casualties already. 1 fellow killed and another wounded by the same shell. I just came back from a forward station and I had a look through some of the trenches. We were there 2 days and could see the German lines. The whole country is one big waste. We had to find breaks in 3 lines of telephone wire. We had lots of fun dodging stray bullets, and the fireworks are simply gorgeous. Star shells are continually in the air, lighting the place like day. I fell into a shell hole at one place and got over my knees in water and mud, but we got in at last, wet and tired, and tumbled into our hole in the ground and slept until 3 o'clock this afternoon. For you see, we do most of our sleeping in the daytime here. They had to lay the telephone lines at night. He was a signaler. To Winnie. Tonight our temporary home is about 10 feet square and is a mixture of sandbags, rails, corrugated iron, bricks, so patched up as to be at least splinter-proof. We just got a great big candle, and by the light of this luxury we can manage to keep the rats away while we get the blankets over us. I hear them running and screaming in the walls, and outside apparently just waiting for us to tuck in, so they can get our crumbs and incidentally scamper all over us. After dark, one can almost step on the big fellows. They are so thick and bold. One even nibbled on Groat's head the other night. Outside I can hear the almost constant rattle of machine guns and the continual cracking of the snipers' rifles. But we know the sound of position of those we need fear, and when they open up we just get under cover, or just drop down and hug the Mother Earth. The machine guns themselves sound exactly like a compressed air or a steam riveter. But if I ever get back and should be going down Chestnut Street, when a riveter started, I suppose I would naturally drop flat on the pavement until it stopped. His letter endings were always unique. For example, I'll have to put the candle out, and if you listen, you will soon hear the snoring of your rat-besieged cousin, Stanley. In this war, there were times away from the front lines where you could see your friends, enjoy the YMCA facilities, which were great, and get cleaned up. We were out in rest now, but having a wet time of it. Raynham Road, outside Dunville, is a good example of what we have here a lot of the time. Last week I saw Bob Culp and Reese and Laitman not far from here. The last Chronicle I received had Mooney Gibson's picture in it. I saw his grave in a cemetery where a lot of Canadians are buried. I couldn't find Orville Campbellfoot's near here, but he was in a different unit. The graves were all neatly kept and constantly looked after. In October 1916, the battery moved south to the area of the Somme, where the British and others had had tremendous casualties. There was heavy fighting near the town of Albert. The statue of the Virgin on the cathedral tower was hanging distraughtly. Today, the tower and the Virgin have been restored. Dear Lou, I came down from the guns day before yesterday. Up there we had a rather bad time of it, since both our major and sergeant major were killed by a shell fighting close to the battery. Everything was blown about pretty badly, and most of my things were buried. I think I'll have to keep my cap for a souvenir, for it was lying beside where I was working, and had a shrapnel hole in it. Fritz didn't gain much, however, because next day the battery was firing at him and giving him more than he gave. We missed the major and sergeant major, because as some of the fellows said, he got our best. As part of the Somme offensive, the Newfoundlanders suffered 70% killed in one battle. Their memorial today demonstrates the whole tragic story over several acres. Stan began writing letters to Evelyn Hext in Brantford in August 1916. At first they began as Dear Friend, but eventually as Dear Evelyn. Every week he received packages of goodies to eat and snaps of life back home. The Nash family, too, sent food and socks and other requests. He was thanking people for their gifts in every letter. Letters took about 3 weeks to get to the front. Dear Friend, I was afraid your last letter would be ruined because they were soaking wet with that which can no longer be sold in Ontario, so I knew that they didn't start out that way. In short, they all got drunk on the way up by a rum jar in the wagon, breaking and spilling all over them. But soon I began reading and enjoyed them very much. Dear Lottie, say sis, do you remember how we used to plan to learn French and travel through France and Italy, and how I wasn't sure if I wanted to be a cowboy or Indian? I am living like an Indian, but I am not rounding up cattle. The creatures I am rounding up are smaller, less useful, and less harder to catch. I usually find them along the seams, and once I find them, I am unmerciful. Therefore, please send along some infallible louse exterminator. In the winter of 1916, there was some respite, but battles took them to Mount Saint Eloi, a famous ruined monastery, and Martinpuch, Pozières, and Courcelette. Back of the lines, a Christmas dinner was enjoyed, plus goodies from home. Thanks for the oil of cedar, for the lice. We fight them whenever we can. Dear Mother, I had a piece of bad news from the wagon line the other day. They say that my old Bill fell and broke his leg and had to be shot. He wasn't a wonderful horse, but since I had ridden him since England, it will seem strange to have another in his place. I think Evelyn wanted to know more about Stan and his philosophy of life, because he writes, Dear Evelyn, when anybody gets a package in the telephone pit, all hands gather round, and as each article comes into view, it is appraised and shared by everybody, and adds very much to our cheer. I haven't attended church since arriving in France, for Fritz, that is Germans, doesn't stop work that day. I could not return your character book because last week all my snaps, personal stationery, and pigskin wallet just got lost somewhere in France unknown to me. Due to censorship by our own officers, I hate to pour forth my inner likes and dislikes. Personally, my motto is to follow out a regular life in whatever branch of work I'm in. But in my own actions and dealing with others, exercising those principles which we hope someday may dominate the world and bring about the peace on earth, goodwill to men, which is the essence of Christianity. I hope you won't think it strange for me to be writing to one whom I have spoken to but twice or three times, but I enjoy such philosophizing. And if you find pleasure in such a correspondence, the pleasure is mutual. I hope that it may continue to afford you sufficient interest that you may continue to write. To a muddy Tommy, Stanley Nash. March 30th, 1917, 3:40 a.m. Dear Lottie, and here comes a poem. I am sitting on the phone, sis, a candle by my side, recalling pleasant memories of the old home fireside. Now, how's that for poetic inspiration? Talk about shells. I was up at the trenches a little way today, and it seemed as though you could have reached up and caught them as they whistled over to old Fritz. There was a great deal of activity in the air, of which Fritz seemed always to have the advantage. One day, an enemy plane flew over our new gun position, so low that you could easily distinguish his eyes as he looked over the side of his fuselage. Needless to say, we quickly dispensed when he scattered machine gun bullets amongst us. The Richthofen Circus, led by that famous ace with his wonderful red plane, that's the Red Baron, patrolled nightly up and down the line as if flaunting before us their superiority and fearlessness. But in spite of the enemy observation, preparations went forward everywhere. Now in April comes the huge preparation for the assault on the Vimy Ridge. No writing took place for several weeks. Many batteries were lined up. A huge tunnel was built under Allied and German lines for infantry to rise up as the battle progressed. And a rolling barrage continued for hours, while each infantry line fired and moved by clockwork as the enemy moved forward. After April 9th, Dad knew it was a victory, but not the significance of the success in the whole war story. As he looked over the shoulder of one man riding home, he saw the message. Today it took Vimy Ridge, very tired. On April he wrote, I guess we are winning, but it means keeping more track of Fritz and following him up. I saw a lot of prisoners and some dead lately. The battles to keep what they had won in the town of Vimy and other towns in the valley lasted for weeks and weeks. April 18th. Dear Lou and John, we've had some fun here lately. 8 of our signalers and Mr. Scott went over the top with the infantry, and Alex Turnbull got some shrapnel wounds in his head. Last night, one of the drivers got his team killed under him, and shrapnel in his leg, so you see Fritz has some shells even though he's going back like the Dickens. May 4th. Dear Will, you wondered about life as a soldier. People thought at first it was a wild adventure, but it is really a patriotic and moral obligation. There's no glorious rallying around the colors, just the work in sun and mud, and everything done as much as possible at night, or under cover to avoid observation. When work calls us, we go out there, but there is no chance for dignity. If a shell comes, you just drop into the nearest shell hole. When a fellow first comes out here full of enthusiasm, he laughs when he hears shells, and he is as neat and as prim as the pictures you usually see. After he sees what shells do, he's seen some of his friends wounded or killed, and had the corners rubbed off, he is quite different. He loses his daredevil spirit and does what is necessary, and for the useless dangers he has no desire. He gets to feel that fellowship spirit, and forgets who he was in civil life and its distinctions. Everywhere throughout the army, there is that good feeling for the other fellow, especially near the front, that comes from a common danger and a common aim. May 17, 1917. Dear Winnie, yesterday I rode by Bill Swayze. He called out to me and I had a chance for a few words. He's in the infantry. No, unfortunately that Christmas parcel didn't get past the submarines, and that just shows you what a nasty fellow old Fritz is. May 18th, France. Dear Evelyn, kind regards to Mrs. Hext and her help with all those parcels. They make life really worthwhile out here. If there's one thing more than another that makes me bitter against Heine, it is his gas, for it is the most inhuman way of killing and permanently killing that I know of. August the 1st. Glad to hear you had a pleasant holiday at Port Dover. Once upon a time, 2 other schoolboys and myself tramped from Dunville to Port Dover, following the lake and carrying a small tent and our grub, etc. Our first camp at Hoover's. It stormed all night and our whole outfit was soaked. Nanticoke was our next stop and then Port. Tonight at the YMCA Center we saw movies of Charlie Chaplin. They brought a laugh at any rate. Sincerely, your war correspondent, Stanley. Dear Evelyn, possibly no one has ever written an ode to do it honor, but there is no more universally useful article at the front than the regulation sandbag. With them, you build your home in them. You tote your rations with them. You wipe and wash your dishes. Sometimes they serve as a mattress. Sometimes they keep the mud off your puttees. Sometimes they keep the rain off your shoulders. They serve to hold the rubbish of the dugout. They make an admirable table cover. They serve, pierced together as a door to a dugout, and in case of emergency, even make a fair towel. If there is anything that has interwoven itself into the life over here more than the sandbag itself, it is the muscle with which they are filled. Dear Win, I'd give a whole lot if I'd paid more attention to Peggy Foster's efforts to make us masters of the French language. As far as I can remember, I always considered that a blank period, because I took no interest in the lesson. But it would be a big help here at times, and save a whole lot of waving of arms and misunderstandings when you made ever so simple a purchase. Dear Dad, just outside our dugout was a dud, a shell which hadn't exploded. One fellow suggested that his pal hold down the shell by straddling it and hit the nose with a sledge. As it turned out, not far away, Fritz put over another one which unkindly exploded. 4 fellows were badly wounded. It was a bad evening, and I feel just a little shaky when I heard a close call this morning. June 1917. Dear Mother, before coming up again, I had a good rest at the wagon lines. There was a sports day of the division while I was there. It was worth seeing. Percy would have enjoyed the fine turnouts of horses. It is wonderful to watch a city of soldiers in the course of daily work. There are corresponding jobs of every city town. Blacksmiths, stores, harness makers, wagons, cobblers, baths, laundries, machine shop, hospitals, waterworks systems, and even cops, military police, and everything organized and working as smoothly as a great city. You will find it all Canadian, from Vancouver, the Middle West, Ontario, Quebec, and the Maritimes. Birthday, July 6th, July 10th, 1917. Dear Mother, the snap of the farm in South Cayuga recalled many happy memories. The old brick schoolhouse, the white church, and Drake's store. But the best spot of them all was the old farmhouse we called home. Stan lived there until he was 10. Yes, Mother, I am 23 years old, and only a boy, I'm afraid, though trying to act like a man. It is pretty difficult sometimes, despite all the good cheer that prevails. But while the will lasts, we can go on and strive to overcome our naturally cowardly instincts with prayer for God's protection. And if by His will we may not see another birthday, we will hope for the rest that is promised to all those who fall, trying to do the little part that is allotted them in His plan, with faith in His leading. September. Dear Lottie, how would you like to have an 8-inch shell come into your back door? Some of the fellows saw a poor Frenchman's home entered that way near our wagon lines the other day. The house was badly damaged, but they said no one was killed. It is sad to see the panic among the civvies when Fritz shells a place where they are still living. But they stick to their homes, naturally not wanting to give up all that they have taken a lifetime to gather for their comfort. In the fall of 1917, the battles raged on, but the 40th Battery trekked north back to the Ypres area and took part in the siege of Passchendaele. To get the guns in position was a Herculean task, Stan wrote. As always, the road was simply a small canal filled to a level with muddy soup, under which was a very irregular footing. The larger holes were filled with brush, between the bundles of which the horses' feet would sink indefinitely. The platforms for the guns were built of planks on the top of layers of sandbags piled in the mud until they ceased to disappear. Thousands of men worked on the plank road, and hundreds lost their lives in its building because of the conditions and also from the almost incessant shelling. The enemy counter-attacked against the newly captured ground, and the 40th Battery received the worst of it. 19 guns were put out of action in one position. In late November, it was relieved by an Imperial battery. Dear Winnie, can you imagine miles of mud, not a blade of grass, and no trees, odd stubs of trees, mostly broken, no houses, only funny concrete boxes, broken down tracks, no roads, only faintly outlined paths of deep muck, lined with demolished transports, no lights at night except gun flashes, and Fritz's flares and the continual pound, pound, pound of artillery fire. As Mr. Cowles would say, it doesn't tend to develop our aesthetic taste. October 27, 1917. Mud Hole Center. Dear Lottie, I haven't had a wash for a day or two, nor much of anything else that goes to make one feel like a decent human being. You have heard of the mud here, and all I can say is that unlike the Raynham Road, this can be washed off fairly easily, provided one ever gets out of it. Your mail came the other day and brought a ray of sunshine. There was also a letter from Mildred Haney. Just now my spirits are buoyed up by the prospect of leave in a few days. November. Stan and 20 others, their turn finally came, went off to Blighty, their word for Britain, for a 2-week leave. At Victoria Station they were met and taken to the Maple Leaf Club. He wrote, "How good that bath felt! And once between white sheets you relaxed into the perfect rest of carefree safety." Sightseeing, traveling to Scotland again, and seeing musical shows went all too fast. Finally, the return trip. The announcement at the English train station. The 3rd Division Artillery, etc., will proceed to Poperinghe, Ypres. Back in Belgium, he writes, we saw the white flecks of smoke following some invisible fleet of Gothras, or planes, and the smoky motor lorry sped us again over the cobblestones into the same old, booming, crumbling, muddy front. Truly, war is awful. Dear Evelyn, my letters lately have, I guess, been rather ragged and disjointed, but I haven't been long enough in one place to collect my scattered wits. Probably there aren't a great many wits to collect. He's writing from an Australian hospital in France with some ear problems. January 8th, 1918. Dear Evelyn, I've just written to Mother a rather difficult letter, for yesterday I received word that my brother Percy, next older than me, had died from the flu while on a survey trip in northern Manitoba. It is the first break in our family circle of 6, and while it is inevitable that it can't always remain intact, I still fear that the shock and anxiety will be very trying to Dad, and especially Mother. Pierce was the only one of my brothers with whom I really became acquainted, because the others had grown and gone before I was very old, and he was a brother worth knowing. He was a kind brother, a loving and helpful son, and his place cannot be filled by another, for he was Pierce, my brother. Pardon me for imposing a sad mood upon you, but you can't talk about those things to those about you to whom it means nothing, and it does one good to talk to one whom you know will understand. Evelyn must have written about wonderful soldiers. Stan replied, An army is a band of men like any other band of men, good, bad, and indifferent, all of them roughened and calloused into an organization of destruction. Our problem for the next few years is to reorganize and mold this mass of humanity into a civil, gentle-mannered army of construction. Many folks won't understand and be intolerant, but I feel confident of at least your friendly help. Your barbarous friend, Stanley. Dear Evelyn, billeted with the family in Rennes. Stan writes, They are a wonderful people, these French. They have endured a great deal on account of the war and are yet just as cheerful. When anything of hardship turns up, they just say, C'est la guerre. You must know that the frequency of my replies is no indication of my lack of appreciation of your letters. And also this week the knitted sweater came and is fine for wearing under one's tunic, where it keeps one warm without being unregimental. I am currently sleeping on a spring mattress, which at one time adorned a French home. But the present occupation of this piece of furniture is resting the tired bones of one Nash, a Canadian. Dear Evelyn, March 1918. I've no doubt you had an enjoyable conference, YMCA, which usually inspires one to think of higher ideals. I'm afraid I have drifted a good way from what I once believed in, but while there is little of religion or moral philosophy that comes to the surface here, still, at least there is no hypocrisy, and a deep-rooted sense of right and wrong in its broadest and most practical interpretation. Dear Margaret, he has learned her middle name. Tonight we are established pretty comfortably in a French cellar with an old door covered with a blanket for a table and a pretty decent little tin stove that doesn't smoke. The bread is crisped on the stove and spread with marmalade. It may not be possible for me to write just as often as I would like for summer months because it is our busy season. For those times I will send the field cards. Before the last big assaults of the war in the summer months, back of the front, there were considerable training and improving of strategies and techniques with the infantry and the artillery together. Divisional sports were carried on with great competition between the batteries. That time there was more time to write in response to Evelyn's curiosity about his personality. May 17th, 1918. Dear Evelyn, tonight your cheery letter came along with some pictures taken in Blighty, England. Really, I don't always look so solemn, and on special occasions I have been known to laugh. Perhaps if the war were over, I might even laugh out loud. I am sure I am profiting in your estimation by being visible only through my letters. You see, it is easy to believe what one wants to believe, and when you picture anyone in your mind, They usually take the form of one of your ideals you've unconsciously tucked away in your mind. Because we are surrounded by such a repulsive environment, our ideals are intensified. Perhaps you and I should share our ideals sometime. As always, Stan. August 15, 1918. Dear Evelyn, the other day there were a bunch of planes reconnoitering, and then at night when he was dropping the odd bomb near where 8 of us were packed in a little 2x3 bivvy, one of the fellows peeked out and, seeing the flares, remarked, "Now I know why Fritz was in the air today. It was to put the hooks in the sky for his lamps." I think my dad thought that was a really nice image. It is now dark, and this is an unsatisfactory letter, because we just had an interruption. Heine, Fritz, is always inquisitive at night, so we may not make a light unless we have a covered dugout, which tonight we do not. I cannot read what I'm writing, so I'd better quit. Pleasant dreams and a bright awakening. I am off to my blankets. I am ever your friend, Stan. For the next few months, the great German offensive proved so successful that they were able to take back a large portion of land which they had lost around Amiens at the expense of the Imperial British Army. The 40th Battery was moved south to the Arras-Bethune road and managed to hold their line. Fighting was very intensive around Amiens. After the main action, as they marched through the city of Amiens, they met fresh American troops asking us what it was like up front and did we know Chicago or Main Street, Minnesota. More fighting along the Arras-Cambrai road, but hundreds of prisoners were being brought back. We think we are winning. August 11th, 1918. Dear Dad, we've been busy with a vengeance lately, and so our letters have suffered. But it has been worth it to know that despite Fritz's spring advance, there is life in the Allied army yet. September 10th, 1918. Dear Evelyn, you wrote a wonderfully frank and interesting letter about ideals. Now, what follows is what I call my father's very Canadian version of the American song, "There's Nothing Like a Dame." He wrote, "The Canadian girls are looked upon, like everything else Canadian, to be quite superior, and apart from the starved, irregular, unnatural, and sometimes violent atmosphere that war creates. Perhaps a fellow may go for months without seeing anything but the merest fringe of civilization. He sees only his mates, waste ground, ruined buildings, mud, dead horses, and shells. He eats maconochie and biscuits, cheese, jam and bread with bully beef for a variety. If he is lucky, he uses the usual utensils, but more often he eats with his jackknife and his fingers minus the table. Can you wonder that the smallest pre-war activities and luxuries of the free, clear, old-time atmosphere under the softening influence of home and the presence of womenfolk seems, to a mind starved for such things, like a picture in a gold frame with a halo resting over it? He sees in that picture the girls at home, the Canadian girls, hardy, rosy-cheeked, reveling in the out-of-doors. He sees her natural, free, and unaffected in mind and manner, not a wallflower, but intelligent, self-reliant and vigorous, yet, lacking through independence, none of that purely feminine grace and charm. Sorry, a painful interruption. As I sat writing, the phone buzzed and one of the telephonists said, "Come quick, there are a lot of fellows hit." And that has ended with the wounded men being placed safely in an ambulance. Next afternoon, to finish the picture, just a simple, wholesome, whole-souled pal, a fellow being with sympathy and understanding, the habit of being cheerful and chock-full of common sense. A person broad-minded, sanely religious but not fanatical, just a real person who, being genuine, can always be just natural. Back to my ideals. I believe in ambition, and if possible, the best effort for financial success, but only insofar as it furthers and makes possible the real success in the things that really matter, the things that endure the oceans of distance and the horrors of war. things that stand out in their natural beauty. There is the love of mother, the faithful care and toil of dad, the friendship and not the acquaintances, the kindness and not the cleverness. Oh, Canada is a wonderful country as it appears on memory's wall, and I am a Canadian. Votre ami tout dévoué, Stan. October 1st, 1918. Dear Sis, the war seems to be going very successfully. The Allies are advancing everywhere, and the Yankees are growing constantly stronger. Still, the casualties give one a heartache. 2 more of our signaling party were wounded. My name has come out in orders for a military medal. There follows a long paragraph explaining why he didn't deserve it more than any other man in his unit. There was heavy fighting on the road to Mons, for as the Germans retreated, they kept attacking and also destroying everything in their path. October 2nd, 1918. Dear Winnie, isn't it good news that Bulgaria has caved in? They are all more or less weary. As a Hun prisoner told me recently, the war is weary, the world is weary, and Germany is weary. He said it in German, but I had managed to retain enough poor old Peggy Foster's moderns to gather his meaning. Oh, that I had paid more attention to Peggy's teaching, instead of throwing ink at Bill Blott and putting pins through Hank Will's desk. October 11th, 1918. Dear Mother, Dad wanted me to tell him some of the things we do. Right now I'm in an old Fritz dugout, because we're in their territory now, about 25 feet underground. In front of me are a little switchboard and trench phone, which are my chief source of worry. The lines connecting up this field set with the other phones cause me much trouble. Whenever Fritz does any shelling in our vicinity, he cuts some of those lines, and 2 of us, as soon as possible, must repair the damage. This dugout is deep, but often our work is just in a shell hole, so we use lamps and flags. Also, it is my job to go forward with the Major when he picks new places for the battery to advance to, and then when they come up, to give the right direction for the guns to fire in. For this we use a kind of surveying instrument. October 14th, 1918. Dear Evelyn, last night I was tuckered out and fed up. For you see, I'd been walking innumerable miles, and then yesterday was trying to do some impossible stunts in the way of telephone lines until my patience was like a cobweb. Naturally, I was mighty pleased to get your letter. From the acquaintanceship formed in all those letters, I value your friendship very much. You've done more than anyone else to add to my pleasure by both letters and parcels. Now I must be brutally frank, as your letter requests. Here follows 5 pages of an explanation of his reluctance to commit any more to the relationship than, at that time, just friendship or jolly good pals, etc., etc. But still I remain your sincere, earnest friend, Stan. November the 11th, 1918, Belgium, France. Dear Mother, this last week has been the most interesting one in the whole war for us, and it is compensation for the rotten times we have had. Last year at this time the Canadians were before Passchendaele, doing what I believe to be the most discouraging fighting of the whole war in knee-deep mud. Today they entered historic town of Mons as victors, on the day that marks the end of fighting, the armistice. If you had seen the joy of the civvies, you would know how they have been tormented by the Germans for 4 long years. November 14th, today, I witnessed one of the scenes that will make the next year a happy one. A Belgian soldier came home. Some neighbor children saw him first and called their mothers, and soon all were carrying his bundles and welcoming him as only those who have known 4 years of Hun oppression could welcome one of their lost dear ones. March 16, 1919, in England. This morning, General Loomis gave a little farewell speech of appreciation. But I hope we can escape that sort of thing when we get home. All we want is the back door left open so that we can creep in, Steal some cookies out of the jar and then seek the living room where we'll find Dad and Mother and sit and talk and be glad. Well, dear friend of my mail, you have been an encouragement and an anchor in my best thoughts in times of troubles. And when in Brantford in the near future, I shall look you up to thank you in person. Stan's unit was given leave to visit the south of France and Paris. They were sent to the training camp in England and didn't return to Canada until March. Back in Halifax, trains took the soldiers east and west throughout Canada. From the last entry in his book, Stan wrote, "So ended the 40th Canadian Overseas Battery. But in the minds and recollections of those who shared its difficulties and triumphs, it still lives and will continue to live as long as memory serves. We do not so much remember the great inspections under the eyes of royalty, the daring deeds or lauded victory. The hardships and discomforts are almost forgotten. But we do remember with a glow of reverent pride the sacrifice of those we left behind, and with the warming of the heart, the pleasant companionship with fellows who were men."